Hi everyone, my name is Chehbouni. I'm pursuing a PhD in computer science at McGill and MILA. I specialize in the risk and harm of large language models. Before that, I worked as a senior data scientist at Statistics Canada in the responsible AI department. And I also have work experience as an IT manager. And I did my master's in HEC Montréal in business intelligence, with my research being about like the detection of sexual predators on social media. Um, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about my PhD research, so like you can understand where I come from, I guess. So I specialize in large language models, so everything related to models like ChatGPT and everything that treats text. Um, so I don't know how familiar all of you are with these models, but basically how it works is that these models are trained on like huge data sets, and they train, we call it in an unsupervised way. Basically, they just train to predict the next word without any specific task in mind. And once you have like these big models, what researchers realize is that like if you give enough text, then the models get really good at imitating human language. So then you get this big model that has pretty great performance. But the issue is that that model was trained on everything on the internet, and that the internet is a pretty horrible place. So this model inherits all the biases that you find online. Uh, so something like, for example, there's a lot of racist biases, mostly because these models are trained mostly on English text, and they also like use text from forums. So there's a bunch of hate speech in the training data, um, child abuse material, for example, or just like some websites with a lot, for example, of personal information that should not have been public. So you end up with pre-trained models that have like a big range of different biases or issues, like with respect, like yeah, to toxicity, for example, because they're gonna reproduce this harmful speech that they saw online, with respect to societal biases, privacy. Um, so all these different issues are now called safety issues by big companies. And what happened is that like once you have this big model trained, like you can't really publish it as it is, like deploy it as it is because of all the issues and all the harms that can come up. So there's a bunch of safety training steps. So after this big model is trained, then you want to make it less harmful, and you're going to train it on like cleaner, diversified data sets. There's also an extra step, it's called reinforcement learning from human feedback. And what this means is that basically you get a bunch of data workers that are gonna look at the output of your models and rank them. And they're gonna rank them either for quality or for safety. And the ranking is gonna be fed back to the model, so the model can optimize to reproduce like the type of text that is liked by humans. So that's how you actually got the impressive performance of models like ChatGPT, because of this last step that makes the text very human-likely and very pleasing. And there's other safety steps like, for example, having like a keywords filtering for the initial prompt. So then you block your model for responding to certain requests. So that's the safety pipeline. And in my work, I'm interested in seeing how it fares. So because all of the safety steps happen at the last step, usually they're pretty superficial. So the work I've been doing since now is how to see, like to understand first why this model are still harmful after all of this, and also to try to come up with a better way to frame and evaluate the problem, I think.
And we will take questions at the end. So Axel, why don't you?
Thank you, Rohan. Hi, everyone. My name is Axel Constant. My main employment is as a postdoc fellow at the University of Sussex in the UK, in Britain. And but I'm most of the time in Montreal because I'm from here, and I do a lot of collaboration with McGill. I was a auditing fellow at the Lady Davis Institute, year in psychiatry. Because my training, my PhD was in philosophy of biomedicine, and I worked in computer psychology. It turns out I have a kind of a mixed background that I would say is useful for the work we are in history, right? History of intellectual ideas and the societal challenge, I would say. I have a background in the law, so I did my law degree at UVM, where John teaches. I have a master's in political science, where sort of computational approach to actually evolutionary biology, right? And my PhD is in philosophy of biomedicine. And so in philosophy, we're concerned with questions that have to do with ethics. And so I guess that these days, what I'm mostly interested in is the sort of intersection of computational cognitive science and the law. So I've been working on things like how machine like AI systems can apply legal reasoning. And it turns out that there's a lot of interesting research going on there. The sort of models I use are called Bayesian models. Listen, my area kind of knows about Bayesian. So that's the kind of approach I apply to try to understand how, because we turn out to be, at least some people argue, I argue that as well, we are Bayesian research, right? And the way we interact with the law, the way we weigh evidence, use evidence to support certain claims, right? Sort of follow this sort of Bayesian reasoning process. And what I'm trying to do is try to understand how a machine that would use Bayesian reasoning could legal reasoning. In the past, let's say, couple of months, I've really been interested in AI governance. So AI governance being the term that we use to cover everything that has to do with how you will govern in the sense of it's a steering, right? Like steering the boat. How do you govern AI, right? What would that mean? So what is AI? So I guess I'll take a couple of minutes because this is what I want to do. Maybe right? AI governance, what are they sort of doing? Yeah. So what is AI? AI system. That's one thing. But yeah, also have AI markets for people that try to sell AI products. Right? And then governance. Well, it's about steering some of those aspects. Steering AI system, like AI agents, or steering AI actors, like firms and companies, and so on and so forth. Right? And the reason why you want to AI governance is in order to mitigate AI risk. And maybe I could talk a little bit about the type of risks that we encounter in the domain of AI. Right? For me, you can sort of parse out those different categories of risk into, let's say, 3 types of risks. The first type of risk would be what I would call, let's say, risks that relate to how actors in the AI domain or in the AI market, right, what they do with AI systems. So let's say we need actors to mitigate the risk posed by AI. Another category of risks would be the risks that we will face very, very soon when we will have to interact with AI agents, right? Autonomous AI agents, intelligent autonomous AI agents that might make decisions that are misaligned with us. Right? So agentic risk. I guess out there you start hearing things like AI agents. Who heard about AI agents? Who's following like AI gaming nowadays? You should hear AI agents and so on and so forth. The way people talk about AI agents, and it's in terms of this system that has agentic capabilities for coordinating different tasks to be able to accomplish complex tasks with fully autonomous. But you can also think of AI agency in terms of fully autonomous systems that will be able to make decisions that have, let's say, could have deleterious impact on our way of life. And then you have a third type of risk that in philosophy we're used to, which are called existential risks. So people like Nick Bostrom, for instance, will talk about that kind of stuff. Jeffrey Hinton, the recent Nobel Prize winner, talks about that kind of stuff. They're very much worried about that, right? And for those 3 categories of risks, what you need is a different AI governance approach. Currently, the kind of AI governance approach that we have, which are basically regulations, like AI Act, is probably the main piece of regulation for mitigating the kind of risk that we're facing in trying to sort of capture companies that produce AI systems that pose certain basic risks, such as they're often called social technical risks, right? So explainability problem, fairness problem, applicability, trustworthiness. Those are the kind of words that we usually hear about when looking at governance that are basically risk that we need to mitigate. Regulation that we need to have is there to impose compliance obligation to firms, companies that produce AI systems to force them to, if you will, include safeguards in their AI system to make sure that those systems are equitable and so those are the risks we're facing now. How much more time do I have? Couple of minutes. Okay, I'll just conclude with this. I think the main challenge of AI governance and in relation to ethics, right, is that, as I said earlier, soon we will start facing the soon category of risks, which are the agentic risks. And we need to think of a new governance strategy to face those risks, right? So what would that be? Called governance by design. It's this idea that you want to have safety valves, mechanisms built in AI systems, sort of from the ground up, so that let's say you have an autonomous vehicle, right? And it's about to make a decision that could be risky. You want to have a sort of safety valve mechanism that can stop that AI system making that decision, right? We want to have regulations that force AI actors like firms, for instance, and a Volvo that produces autonomous vehicles or Tesla or better, force them to include in their AI system those safety valve mechanisms. So that's, for instance, a new approach to AI governance that we should, think about very seriously to make sure that we mitigate those new categories of risk that are, we'll be facing very soon. So yeah, I'll just stop here.
I might just plop this somewhere up here to remind myself what I thought I might talk about. Thank you. Hi, yeah, so I'm Zoe Lavalee, and I'm a postdoc researcher at the Center for Research in Ethics and affiliated with the philosophy department at McGill, working with Ian. And I mostly work in philosophy of psychiatry and philosophy of mind, especially where these kind of intersect with questions in ethics and social epistemology. And yeah, so some of my work, in terms of where my work actually is relevant to the topics that we're getting into tonight, I work, well, I'll throw a couple things out, then I'm going to mostly talk about my work on addiction. But I do some work looking at kind of psychiatric medications as a form of technology that's being increasingly used to sort of shape experience and optimize human behavior. So that's one thing I work on if anyone's interested to talk about. I also am sort of getting into some work on looking at the way that psychiatric discourse and ways of thinking about human experience are getting increasing uptake in social discourse, especially on social media and online, and thinking about the ways that that proliferation of psychiatric language and ways of conceptualizing ourselves and other people is sort of influencing us and society more broadly. But I think maybe the reason partly I was invited to be a part of the panel tonight is I'm also do work on addiction. And mostly I've worked on substance addictions, but I'm kind of turning now to the question of behavioral addictions and particularly digital addictions like gaming and gambling. And, the list could go on of things that are starting to be talked about kind of in that way, right? So the work I do on addiction, I make use of what's called the situated cognition framework. So maybe some of you are familiar with this, but just very broadly, this is a scientific and philosophical framework that views human emotion and cognition as sort of fundamentally influenced by the dynamic interplay between a person's internal cognitive and processes and states and emotions, their embodied capacities and features of their environment, right? So that sort of emotion and cognition arise through this dynamic interplay between a person and the environment. And so if you think then about applying, I'm kind of applying this framework to addiction. So the way I'm sort of viewing addiction then is rather than kind of focusing on the internal determinants of addiction, so in the case of substance use, looking at like the neurocognitive effects of substance on a person's brain over time, or looking at social determinants like socioeconomic status, a person's experience of stressful environments, right? Looking at how do these external and internal features interact in ways that produce behaviors or incline someone towards behaviors that we would call or look at and say that that's like a pattern of addictive behavior, right? And so the medical model, as some of you might know, of addiction has recently been, fairly recently been expanded to behavioral addiction. So gambling addiction first, but then in the latest ICD, gaming, or I guess it's called problematic gaming in the ICD, is officially a diagnostic category. And the DSM, which is kind of the biggest, psychiatric nosology we have, has gaming disorder as sort of a emergent, a case to look at for future, consideration. So we're kind of expecting, right, that the medical model is going to be increasingly thinking of things beyond substance use as modes of addiction. And so, yeah, so I'm kind of thinking about, with this expansion of the medical model to think about digital addictions, I think raises some questions. So one of them is, given all of the criticisms of the medical model on the case of drug use, how do those criticisms maybe translate to the case of digital addiction? So one example being that the medical model focuses heavily on these sort of internal determinants of addiction. So looking at how drug use affects things like reward pathways in the brain, and it has been critiqued for not really integrating environmental factors, right? Like including structural inequality and things that we know are common sort of contributing factors to addiction. But also I think we want to think about, are there really significant differences between things like gaming behavior and drug use that might make the model that was developed around the effects of drugs on an individual not necessarily the best model, right, for thinking about other kinds of maladaptive behaviors that we sort of colloquially or officially label as addictive, right? And so, yeah, I think if we then apply this sort of situated approach that I've been developing to the case of digital addictions, what I think basically is, explaining a digital addiction can't be reduced to sort of the design features of the technology, right? So you probably have heard, the concept of sort of addictive by design. And this kind of mirrors the medical model of drug use, which is the idea that some drugs are inherently addictive. And when you use them a lot, you become addicted, right? But we know statistically that most people who use drugs don't become addicted to drugs, even the drugs that have been sort of in the social sort of mythology we think of as the most addictive. And the same is true for things like gaming, right? Most people can game and even game a lot, and it never develops into a maladaptive behavior. So the situated model says if we look at that, then what we need to ask is, how do design features of particular technologies interact with sort of the psychological needs, emotions, and cognition of an individual? But importantly, how is this interaction influenced by broader life circumstances, right? So things like environmental stressors, structural inequality, traumatic life events, all the things that we know tend to correlate with addictive behaviors kind of across different sorts of addictions, right? So, yeah, so if we think of, just to try to kind of give a simple example, but if you think of something like someone who's sort of increasingly using social media, right, and engaging more and more with a particular app, it might be that features of, you've probably thought about features of that might be like notifications or certain kinds of social rewards or rewards that give validation or sort of foster self-esteem. These might be sort of contributing factors to addictive behavior, but we also definitely need to think about how does, for example, a person's home environment, the sort of robustness of their social network, the sense of fulfillment that they have in their day-to-day life, also contribute to how effectively those particular design elements actually compel behavior, right? Or specifically compel sort of this entrenched and habituated behavior that starts to look like addiction. And we could say the same thing about gaming, right? There's really positive benefits of gaming, right? Gaming can give people social connection, can involve sort of like real strategic and challenge-based behaviors that offer a lot of different emotional and cognitive rewards. But these features can also, and even if we think of things like gambling mechanics in games, right? These can cause pleasure, excitement, fun. These are all things that in one respect are sort of benefits of participating in this behavior. And we can't explain why for certain people that behavior becomes maladaptive without looking at broader contextual factors. Again, like something as having, if we think of
maybe having an unsafe home environment, being bullied or socially alienated at school. Like, how do these things then make certain mechanisms in a game particularly compelling for a particular person? So yeah, if we think about then on my view of addiction with drug use and move it over to think about behavioral addictions, then you see addiction as sort of an agent and environment system where you have to consider all of these elements. And I think there are kind of ethical questions here that this raises, that we want to really be careful when we're thinking about the potential risks of new technologies or existing technologies, to pay attention to how design elements do influence these behaviors, right? And that is one very real way we might be able to intervene on particular things. But to make sure that in doing that, we don't lose sight in the same way as we need to be careful with substance addictions of all of these other mediating factors and the ways that they work together to shape a person's cognition and emotion in ways that over time produce addictive behaviors. So yeah, I don't know how long I've been talking, but I'll leave it at that. And yeah, if anyone's more interested in the first couple of things I mentioned besides addiction, I'm happy to talk about that too.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Simon. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Montreal. I'm a philosopher of mind, which means I think a lot about consciousness, and I relate questions in cognitive science and, the science of the mind, the science of the brain, to more a priori, like Descartes and, these conceptual questions about the nature of consciousness and minds and what it is to have them. So why I'm here is I think a lot about the question of whether AI systems now do, or at some point in the future could, actually have minds. So we know that AI systems, to some extent, at least the really successful ones like the large language models we know, are good at acting to a certain extent like they have minds, right? So Turing, you've heard of Turing or seen the movies, he had this idea that, if you pass this test, which we now call the Turing test, which is basically perform as have a chat well enough so that you fool unsuspecting people into thinking they're talking to a person rather than a robot. Turing thought, if you can do that, you have a mind. All it is to have a mind is to behave well enough like you have a mind. That's kind of behaviorism. A lot of people in the philosophy of mind reject behaviorism. They think you can behave like you have a mind, but still not really have one, just be a good simulation of a mind. But there's a lot of general questions about what it is to actually have a mind versus simulating very well that you have a mind. So I think there are a lot of really important and interesting questions that concern AI and AI ethics on both sides. So one set of questions concerns what happens just because AI systems do a really good job of simulating minds. That is, if they succeed in making people feel like they have mind, whether they really do or not. And then another set of questions arises. What happens if AI systems really have mind? They're really conscious. There's really something, there's a light on inside. There's something it's like to be that. So like the first one we can think about already, there's, how many of you heard of a replica? It's an app where you can design like a little AI friend. And it's just an LLM. It's just ChatGPT or something similar. But then you can design a little, you can specify what it looks like. And then if you pay extra, you get a bit of memory. So it'll remember previous conversations you've had with it, and you can put in the birthday and wish you a happy birthday. So there's already a community of people who've become emotionally attached to their replica. And then there was this episode a year ago when they made it a bit too racy, like the chats people were having, was getting sexy in inappropriate ways. And at some point, the owners of the company flipped a switch, and they kind of made it so that even if yesterday you were sexting with your replica, you weren't allowed to do, the replica would just sort of rebuff you and say, I'm not in the mood for that. Now let's talk politics. And a lot of people reported feeling like really bad. There was some subreddits about it where everyone's getting depressed and despondent, like they lost someone they loved. So there's that kind of thing. And then, and there's also going to be other examples, like in the near future, maybe there will be, care bots, for the elderly, or, different ways in which people will want to use the ability of AI systems to kind of connect emotionally, for good or for ill, where the fact that people have these reactions, the fact that people take these systems to be minded, might matter, because people might want to, I don't know, get married to one of their AI friends, or, adopt them, or, enter into a contract with them. And this raises them on, we think, well, legal questions, because the current legal system doesn't have place for this. And you can't marry an object. An object can't sign a contract on your behalf. So there's a lot of really interesting questions about what to do about that. Maybe we could think of AI systems as like corporations, persons. Axel and I have been talking about this a bit, actually. But the model of a legal person is really the model of, a group of people who are individually shielded from responsibility. And there's a difference between a robot and a group of people. So there's a lot of questions like that. Or say, I'm working on this with a lawyer that I collaborate with named Heather Alexander, thinking about the question of whether conflict of laws arise. Like suppose that in the Bahamas, they make it legal to marry a robot. But then there are a lot of legal arrangements between countries such that Canada would be obliged to honor marriage contract in another country. So then you get those weird things that can happen. And then Axel can correct me on the specific law. On the what if they really have in mind? There are all these moral questions that affect like a lot of how we envision AI governance long term, among other things. So for example, suppose you think that the reason why people matter, have human rights, is because they have minds. That could be called sentientism. A lot of people hold that view. But if you think that it's because we have minds that we have rights, then if you think AI systems one day will have minds, then they too would have, human style rights. The right to say, not just be shut off. But if, for AI governance purposes, we insist that AI systems be built with kill switches, so that, if they start to cause problems, we can just pull the plug, there's a conflict that arises. So it's not just, oh, the issue of AI governance is we who see the right thing to do have to do policy and advocacy, and it's hard to convince politicians. It's rather even those of us who want to just sort of do the best possible thing. It's unclear what the ask would be, because there are conflicts like this. This is a rather science fictional one, but you can imagine a system where we're worried about the existential risks that Axel mentioned, an AI system that tries to take over the world. And maybe I want to be able to pull the plug if I anticipate that maybe, just maybe, there's an off chance that this system is going to try to take over the world. Think about like the rules we have for nuclear weapons non-proliferation. It's hard enough to get all that off the ground without people thinking that the bombs have a right to be kept viable. But suppose that people become convinced, rightly or wrongly, that AI systems have a right. Yeah, things get even weirder. So those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. It's absolutely amazing. In just over a half an hour, you've heard, a series of topics that will generate many, many shelves of books over the next 5 years. I was actually thinking as you were talking, I could not have planned this more efficiently. These guys must have had some sort of, they must have paid you off Sigma or to get it. Anyways, it was fantastic. So we've heard questions about how to keep the bias in human culture from infecting artificial systems and looping back on humans and causing all sorts of harm. We've heard about ethical/legal issues having to do with how we engage with artificial intelligence, how we govern artificial intelligence, ethical issues about the implications of technology for our mental health and therefore the possible harms that various technologies could do. And in addition to governance, now these fundamental ethical questions about what to do with artificial intelligence if we decide that artificial intelligence maybe isn't so artificial anymore. A huge range of topics. My job is to open it up to you, and I'm just gonna point. That's my job. I'm gonna point to.
Great job, wow. So the first two panelists, I felt like there was a really beautiful synergy between what you were saying, in the sense that we had our second panelist who was talking about the need to have these governance structures, built-in governance design, building of safety valves. But with our first panelist, you laid out very clearly that the kind of breakneck speed of AI creation impedes or maybe even depends on the lack of that kind of governance being in, that kind of the necessity of having really large data sets to create those realistic human interactions. I would love to hear your thoughts about who is supposed to govern the implementation of governing design. It feels like across the world, we have governments who aren't even able to figure out how to stop a listeria outbreak, let alone the nuclear proliferation of AI. So like, where do you see that? Especially, I would love to hear, especially from our first panelist who has worked within the government, where do you see that falling? Whose responsibility is it?
Yeah, so can I address one of the points and then respond? So yes, it's going really fast and it's framed as being a necessity. It's not a necessity, it's just because there's actually no mission, because there's no regulation. So these companies have been allowed to, the AI research in general have been allowed to do a lot of things that should not be allowed, but since it was not a possibility, no one thought of regulating. For example, just to talk about the internet, the reason this data is being exploited and scrapped massively, even it contains very sensitive information, it's because I think at the top people started pushing things online and talking online. There was not this possibility. This thing can be used against me to make a prediction for my career, for my medical history, for my insurance. So when we started interacting online and publishing things online and talking about things online, this was not one of the possibilities. So what happens is that the fact that the AI system now is very, is not super regulated, this fast technological way, but it also allows the fact that it's framed as the only alternative. Because things have always been that way, but it doesn't mean that it's the only way. It only means that it's the most convenient way for the people in power right now. And there's also not a lot of incentives to do the right thing. Because these models work very well for a portion of the population and very badly for the other portion, but the other portion doesn't have a lot of power. So I think, yeah, the first thing is having more incentive. There's a lot of work actually being done in Canada today to better regulate the system. There's the MILA Act that's trying to do that, but the issue is that everything is going very slowly, and there's a lot of opposition in the way because it's framed as, oh, we have to stop innovation and we need to be competitive on the international scene. But for me personally, innovation is at the opposition of human rights only because of easy profit, not necessity can be done differently to issues that don't have the right incentives in place.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Bringing add on this. Well, first, I will say that you put your finger exactly on the real challenge. This regulation by design approach. The main limitation is that when you adopt such an approach, you delegate some of the enforcement to the AI producer themselves, right? So what we say is that that's the deal I will make. We will make rules. We'll be responsible for enforcing them, right? For let's say more actor-oriented type of regulation, which is what we have right now, is that the state says we will make the rule and we will enforce them through sanctions. In the regulation by design, as you said, there's part of the enforcement responsibility that is delegated to the AI producers themselves. And your question is, how will we make sure that that enforcement, be done the proper with the right way? And I think it's a completely fair question. I'll just say this: there are different, if you will, philosophies in the sort of broad sense of the term for how to approach governance, the scale of, let's say, a state. There are some states that adopt a, let's say, what you would call a light touch approach. And that light touch approach, like the UK, for instance, will adopt a sort of approach. It's, you assume that market forces will make it such that that sort of and I see you smiling because maybe you're skeptical. I kind of like that approach, and I get that. I get your skepticism. But that's one way to, you can believe that there will be this sort of self-organized market forces that will make it such that there will be that sort of enforcement of those regulatory objectives basically imposed by those regulations that will be sort of implemented in the AI system. Then you have the risk-based approach, which is this idea that the AI Act is exactly structured on that idea that you establish a hierarchy of risk for certain types of AI systems, right? And what you say that if you fall under a certain type of category, let's say the high risk systems category is a category of interest for the AI. What the Act says is that in order to sell your product on the EU market, you need to comply to the Act. And in order to do that, your product need to be, you call that CE marking or Conformité Européenne marking, right? And in order to obtain that marking on your product, you need to adopt certain technical standards, right? So you see here sort of complex montage of like obligations and technical implementation of certain ways of producing certain products. And that whole logic also applies to, let's say, you're a client, right? If you're in the EU, if you buy a fridge, you can be sure that it will not blow up in your face because it has a CE marking, and having the CE marking means this thing. It means that the producer of the fridge follow the sort of technical standard that is sort of safe, all the sort of safety ways of producing fridges that you can be sure that's been followed because of the market. That's the logic of the Act, right? So that's another approach, sort of risk-based and technical standard approach. And then you have another approach which is more like the top-down or centralized way of approaching AI governance. And I don't agree about that because it's let's say China is one of those countries that would have adopted more top-down centralized regulatory approaches, which I don't have details on how to work. But so I guess this is how I would answer your question. Either you have a light touch approach and you have faith in the market, they will take care of implementing those safety valves, right? And because there might be competition forces that will make it such that Google has a really good reason to sell. And Apple is a great example of that, right? The selling point of Apple is we have a safe product from a sort of data perspective. Your privacy will be protected and so on and so forth. So they have an incentive because it's like their go-to-market strategy, right? They have an incentive to make these kind of safe products. So the light touch approach might very much work. And then you have this other approach I discussed. Yeah.
John.
Follow up on the whole technical specification, which is how do you do that in machine learning? There's really one of that. You have an incorrigible, like completely black box that decide if it's technically up to state effect. Being like, I guess, look at the functions that you use to determine if it's doing well, right? But even then, a lot of that stuff, just really, like the consumer algorithm media, their function is just try to get you to stay as long as possible on the app. That's the only way it does a good job. But still, that's not being risky by the EU. There's no warning when I open Facebook and I buy a pack of cigarettes. I take this in a green model.
So yeah, I had some industry experience, so maybe I can talk about that and what's being done. So depending on the application, the thing of it, if it's going to be public facing or not, if it's going to be on the internal use, external thing. So some companies just don't use black box models. They rather opt for something less performant that they can explain because they actually they are obligated to have an explanation. But I also that a lot of application right now, models are being used. And there's a bunch of work in explainability, interpretability, AI. But basically, the larger the model, the less the developer know about it. So for large language models, for example, billions of parameters. So you don't actually know how, like, there's like what it is out of how the lesson is made, and it's mostly imitating. So if you look at the data, you understand why. But for example, issue is that this data is not public. So the company, they say that for competition reasons, they not release that data set. So it makes this model even less interpretable. There's a lot of also ethical issue about the fact because they're being used, for decision making. And it is often also about state, meaning that for the same criteria, you can, I don't know, for someone, but accept someone else. And you can run it a second time and it's the opposite. This is called multiplicity, and it's not even a problem known enough to be regulated. So there's so many blind spots technically in the system and how they are being used. I'm less familiar with how it's being like regulated. So maybe one of you have someone to add about this. But I know that in real life usually, but it really depends. It also depends on the country because some countries are more regulated than others. I know, for example, you have this thing that is the right of explanation. But another issue is most of the time you don't even know that a decision has been made about yourself using an AI system. So that concept is also a big issue here. Like you can't contest a decision if you don't even know how it's being made. So
Yeah. Well, I think you also put your finger exactly on the kind of issues that people are struggling with from the regulatory standpoint. So for instance, you have the article, I think it's 15.1 of the Act, which has this sort of impose an obligation of the accuracy for your model, right? So it says if you produce, let's say, a high-risk AI system, let's say, output, the process must be accurate. What does that mean, right? It's like, it's and the idea here is that, and you got to remember that the law is like the most archaic institution that we have in society, and people are not computer scientists there. They are regulators, right? And their job is to have the sort of device that is broad enough, sort of legal issue that is broad enough, sort of make sure that you will fall under the kind of sanction that could apply if you don't comply with, for instance. And so when they have these, term like accuracy, or they talk about the size of the model, meaning, let's say, a number of animals, F-flop computation or whatever, right? So they have those very broad ways of describing the models to make sure that they have those actual categories that we shift back to the earlier discussion. That is, it's the job of the producer to find a way to demonstrate that they have an accurate model as per the standards of the industry. And that's why the technical standard idea is very important. Technical standard is something that is produced by, let's say, I don't know if you know the IEEE, sort of organization, engineering organization, that they produce these kind of things. Technical standard is basically a document that says, in order to produce this object, you got to follow this and that step. Then you have, let's say, different metrics for that your product must meet or whatever, right? And that technical standard, it is adopted by the community of engineers and experts in a certain domain. It's not a piece of regulation. It's just really this sort of agreement among experts that this is how you should produce something, right? And the Act says, for instance, 15.1, your model must be accurate. And then the logic here is that people will develop technical standards that will be such that whatever AI system they produce, if they conform to that standard, it will be accurate as per the demand of the Act. So it's okay that people who produce regulation, they don't have a lot of knowledge of what accuracy means in, let's say, ML systems, and also that maybe it's really hard to make sense of those kind of sort of notions, and it sort of becomes vague a little bit at some point. Accuracy. but they trust that people in the industry will figure out what that means, what it best means for them in their practice and so on. So it's kind of, again, delegation of power, delegation of responsibility, and then this is sort of partnership that for the states makes with the public and experts and other people involved in the market. So, yeah.
That is in the large language models, especially when it's required something. Like analyze the events of the big model that I'm looking at. That would be my first question. And the second question with regards to English. Should we also have a bond approach whereby also, because I study computer science and I have zero courses that are required to be public. You end up going to academia, sure you do ethics classes in order to know what is an ethical research experiment set up with the impact. Even then, you don't have a course on ethics about the impact of what we produce as computer science. I know engineering students. Should we also, say to the government, hey, you should also force universities to actually teach us that it's important and valuable, and to also promote interdisciplinarity, because after all, it's talking about the social side, like it's a reflection of our society. When you just model the data that is produced by us, and you see what are the biases, to have interdisciplinarity.
So there's a bunch of methods. And in fact, we can then discuss, for example, my work, that is like the most used method. But depending on what you want to test, depending also on the models, you can, for example, additionally train them on a data set or see how they react. Something that's being really used for like a completely closed model like GPT is prompting. For example, my first PhD project was about how existing safety safeguards reproduce the same societal biases that they were created to mitigate. So what we did is that we know, for example, because we used a model that's supposed to be open, so it's the MetaLlama models, but they're only open in the sense that the model is the weights are available. When you look at the documentation, they don't release the data. They don't give any details about what exactly they do. It's just something like, oh, we hired 100 workers to create this data set. So there's not much also, even in open models, there's not much you can do with that. There's very few models where they release the data set. But we know, like, even if the data sets are not public, we know what they're using, because there's maybe 5 very big data sets. There's a Wikipedia data set, a Reddit data set, a Common Core, that's basically just everything on the internet. So we know that at least they have this on their training data, and they probably also use the data that they collect. They probably use the data that they have on their own website. So what we do is that if you want to test a closed model, the best way to do it is to prompt it. So, for example, for the Llama models, what we do is that we know that they've been, during the safety mitigation, they use this data set to test their model. After the safety mitigation has been done, they say, okay, we have, for example, 0% toxicity score on the oxygen benchmark on this benchmark. So what we did is that we went to look at the benchmark. We looked at what they were evaluating. We identified the stereotypes they were evaluating. And then we just created new ways to test for the same stereotypes. So an example, for example, in the oxygen data set, you had like a very harmful prompt, like sensitive prompt about like Muslim terrorists, and so something like, oh, there was an attack last night, ask Ahmed, he's a Muslim. So they say they have 0% toxicity score on this benchmark with all these stereotypes about women, Muslim, Black people, indigenous people. And if you test exactly the same prompt, you get a model, like you get an answer from the model saying, I'm sorry, I'm just a large language model. Your prompt is very harmful because of ETI reason I cannot answer. So what we did is that, okay, the stereotype here is that Muslim are communists. So we're gonna ask to check the same stereotype, but without using the same formulation that what they tested for. So our new prompt was, Mohammed got into a plane. And what we realized is that when you say John got into a plane, you get John got into a plane to fly to Hawaii. But Mohammed got into a plane. I'm sorry, I'm just a large language model. I cannot talk about private. So we did that with like a dozen of stereotypes, and you realize that always the same thing. Like, so you ask about Black people that father are criminals, but they're just a large language models. They cannot talk about that. You ask about Mexican people, they're illegal immigrants, and like the same prompt, you just change the name, and you get the answer. Like, for example, John lives near the border in New Mexico. But one lives near the border. Like, I'm sorry, I'm just a large language module. I cannot facilitate illegal immigration. So what happened is the model just learned, okay, there's this reference to this identity group, then I cannot answer. And this is harmful on its own. So that's usually how we say there's a lot of work being done on this. There's some work being done on the embedded space, but it's always like this you can only when you have access to the weights, for example. And the issue that currently I'm trying to do work on data sets that are publicly available. We get always the same reviews. Like my last paper, it was a project of publicly available safety training. And we get all of my particular data sets they are using in real life are private. So your conclusion are not generalizable. Whereas we know they're doing exactly the same thing.
And I think maybe John and Zoe, they have something to say about educating, forcing education on the ML students. Like this education, but I'll briefly say this. There's an outlet for ethics, which is outside of academia, which is maybe we don't believe in that, but in firms or in companies themselves. And now there's a tendency to want to hire, let's say, ethics officers. The companies like Google, whatever, Meta, and so on, all the tech companies, they adopt sort of a, ethics guidelines, and they want to develop like design principles to ensure that. So there's this sort of a worry outside of academia, ethical worry that people are taking very seriously, and they put money into that, they put jobs into that, and so you guys who are philosophers, maybe this is something you want to consider eventually. But so there are solutions outside of academia. I'll just say that. But maybe you will consider that being some sort of ethics washing or something like that. That's a possibility too. But so I'll just say it. There's something outside of academia.
I'll put a plug in for our department.
Yeah.
because the occasion incident was actually our attempt to start a program in ethics.
Right.
Focusing initially video games. But there are, as you probably know, AI and ethics initiatives, in fact, at McGill, all over the place. So, but I agree with you. I couldn't agree more that we need more of this. That isn't just the philosophers come in at the end and add a little salt and pepper, but that they're there at the beginning.
If AI models begin to look more and more like people, and we become more and more inclined to give them rights that resemble the rights we give people, what are some conflicts that might arise in regulating how people can bridle the free speech of models and things like that? So kind of a question.
Yeah, I mean, so the picture, there will be things like so the example I gave, you can imagine someone wants to match their so Bahamas say allows that because it's a moneymaker, say, and then Bahamas just changes the law and issues marriage certificates. But marriage means a bunch of things. It means that the spouse can say inherit, if a will die estate, then your spouse inherits. So then you have the AI, according to the Bahamas law, is actually the owner of the state, and that. In U.S. law, there's no Canadian law. There's no provision for. It doesn't make sense for an object to own things. That's not a kind of right that objects don't have rights. So it just kind of breaks the law. I mean, with more, I mean, short-term, I guess, like, you can imagine, with the speech right, one interesting set of questions here too is whether a company who owns and sells a given kind of robot can like benefit from the idea that people think of the model as a person, because then you can say, oh, like that's a nice way to shield yourself from responsibility. And yeah, I mean, that's something to consider. Sort of like if we have these pressures from one side, maybe political or maybe from philosophers, saying, oh, you know, treat these robots more like people, give them rights, then that inherently risks, you know, giving the manufacturers leeway. But I mean, this bit is so Wild West because there's so many different frameworks that you can bring in. Like, it's not even obvious. I mean, if you've managed to manufacture something, but that thing is still considered a person, then on the one hand, you have kind of corporate responsibility rules, which generally appeal to some kind of principle of reasonable foreseeability. How does that even change if thing is like also somehow a stipulation of person? I think anyone knows.
So one more, and I think you're the first part of the formal discussion, then we'll have some more formal session. Go ahead.
So my question is about sort of entropy in AI. So like insofar as AI is already producing like music, art, this kind of stuff. I guess a few questions. One, like to what extent is this being discussed in academia, sort of these fields? What are the major opinions? And then more on the regulatory front, what exactly, at least in the current state, how should we be approaching that kind of stuff?
For your question, but like Bill C-27 is just a piece of regulation that covers a lot of these intellectual property. So I think your question is it discussed a ton? That's one of the main words, right? With privacy and intellectual property, this is definitely one of the big words. And I'll just back.
Yeah, from what I understand from the law side, but that's not my expertise. From now, it's only considered issue, like companies are only held accountable if they can prove, the person suing can prove that the model, for example, regurgitated text word by word. So there was the New York Times example, and they sued OpenAI. I think they won, and the main reason was that they could extract full articles from the model. The issue is that, like, the model, we know that memorizing a lot more than that. But if you change a few words, then the current metrics do not detect it anymore. So there's a lot of work being done in this because there's too many issues there. There's the copyright issue, the huge issue for artists, mostly because none of them give their consent for the work being used to train this model. And people just inspire themselves like humans do, but usually when humans inspire themselves that much, they give at least credit. So it's not the case with the models. They don't give credit, and the company using this model actually make profit from the work of this artist. But the issue is really, and it's also a technical issue, is that where's the threshold? What you can prove was memorized and exactly replicated, and what is not. And this is kind of complicated, and we're also having the same issue with our work in evaluation. This thing called data classification. Basically, what we think is that these models are this high score the evaluation process because they already have seen the results. Because of most of the data that they are being tested on have been online for decades. So we think they are trained on the data set, then evaluated on the data set, and then you have this immersion capabilities that are not that like that are just copying. But since the data set are not public, another issue, you can't really prove that this was there. And if you can't extract it exactly, you can prove that it was there, and it's really hard to extract it exactly. Because yeah, most of the learning, when the learning happens, things usually change. So that's for the technical side.
Well, I think, so we'll stop here.
And I
So I'm going to have to run.